There are records that begin with a warning as simple as it is brutal. On the morning of February 12, 1906, none of the 63 lanterns reappeared at the mouth of the mine. This is how many researchers begin their files on the case of the Cumberland sisters, one of the most incomprehensible disappearances in the history of mining in Tennessee. The first lines, written in faded ink, carry a weight that seems to bend the edges of the paper. It is as if the record is aware of the responsibility of telling something that has never been fully explained. The protagonist of this account is Jonathan Hale, a 38-year-old miner who lives in the small community of Blackridge Hollow, nestled among damp valleys, dirt roads, and forests of twisted cedar trees. The village, which barely appeared on maps, lived under the economic rule of the company that had been mining the local subsoil since 1892. The main pit, informally known as the Cumberland Sisters Iron Pit, was named not after a legend, but after two former owners of those lands, Margaret and Elise Cumberland, whose surnames remained engraved on contracts, fences, and oral histories. The Hale family was known for its quiet dignity. Jonathan lived with his wife Clara and two young children, Samuel and Ruth. The narrow house, with its wooden porch and rusty roof, was described by neighbors as always smelling of strong coffee and coal in the air. He had worked in the mine since he was 15, half his life devoted to long shifts, noisy machines, and tunnels that seemed to swallow time. Nothing about him suggested someone predisposed to the improbable. He was just an ordinary man trying to keep his family above uncertainty. Documents from the time describe in detail the social landscape of those days. The winter of 1906 had been harsher than usual. The water accumulated in the valleys froze into thin sheets, and the morning fog made the landscape indistinct, as if each house were a drawing about to be erased. The community gathered in the mornings at the company shed, where the miners were counted, warned, and instructed. Life there operated with almost mechanical regularity, schedules marked by whistles, short meals and quiet nights, interrupted only by distant dogs or a train crossing the fields miles away. Jonathan was generally considered a reliable man, with a stable mood and few exaggerations. There are no reports of serious conflicts with colleagues or supervisors. Clara was said to be observant, but reserved, always with a cloth tied to her hair and a gaze that seemed to sniff out small changes before anyone else. The family was modest but well regarded. Nothing in the records indicates alarming deaths, serious illnesses, or internal tensions that would justify any breakup. However, when reviewing the paperwork generated by the company itself and the newspapers in the weeks following the disaster, one silent detail repeatedly emerges, and therein lies the initial shadow of mystery. In at least 3 statements from Jonathan's colleagues, there is the same observation, noted almost in passing, as if it did not deserve much attention. He lingered a few minutes longer near the elevator, looking down the shaft as if calculating something. No one could say exactly what that meant. Some interpreted it as mere fatigue, others as hesitation. One supervisor even suggested that Hale might have been assessing the stability of the internal walls, since in the previous days there had been a slight tremor felt above the surface. But the file does not treat this observation as trivial. On the contrary, it is one of the last pieces of verifiable information about Jonathan before he disappeared forever into the damp darkness of the mine. The report by the engineer responsible for safety, a document that now lies yellowed in a municipal archive, concludes the first chapter with a sentence that interrupts the natural flow of the records. Hale seemed to hear something that the others did not notice. There is no technical explanation attached, no additional comments, just that sentence, dry and lost among bureaucratic terms, as if the engineer had tried to record something he did not know how to formulate precisely. And it is precisely this sentence that establishes the first point of tension in the narrative. Because if Hale heard something, no one else reported any unusual noise that morning. And yet, all 63 lanterns that descended with his lanterns that were supposed to reappear at the end of the shift would never return to the surface. The block ends where the questions that would span decades begin. What exactly did Jonathan Hale see when he looked down into the mine that cold morning? To understand the weight of what happened at the Cumberland sisters' iron pit, the archives always suggest the same path. One must first descend into the ordinary days, into the routine, into what seemed too solid to disappear. Company reports, cross-referenced with letters from families and notes from a local Baptist pastor, allow us to reconstruct in some detail life in Blackridge Hollow in the weeks leading up to February 1906. It was not a place of great events. The village consisted of wooden houses lined up on two main streets, both dirt roads, cut by narrow ditches where rainwater flowed slowly. There was a grocery store, a small tool warehouse, a simple church with a cracked bell, and the company's large black shed, which stood as a constant reminder of who really ruled there. Jonathan Hale always woke up before the first glimmer on the horizon. Clocks were few and far between and not always reliable. What regulated the miners' awakening was, for the most part, their own bodies. His already knew, with almost cruel precision, the moment when the world shifted from absolute darkness to a lighter grey. Clara was usually in the kitchen when he got up, stirring coffee in an old kettle, trying to ward off the cold with the wood stove and a thick shawl over her shoulders. In statements taken decades later, Ruth, the youngest daughter, would recall that her father always gently ran his hand over her head before leaving. He said little. It was his gestures that spoke for him, placing a piece of bread next to his daughter's mug, patting his eldest son on the shoulder, adjusting Clara's coat without looking her directly in the eye, as if any longer exchange of glances might delay him. This kind of emotional modesty is mentioned more than once in the interviews. Jonathan was a man who loved in silence. Daily life in the village revolved around the mine. The men went down into the mine, while the women kept house, looked after the children, sewed and washed clothes in the shallow river that cut through the valley. On sunny afternoons, you could hear children's laughter mixed with the distant sound of machines and pickaxes reverberating underground. The pastor wrote in one of his notebooks, "It is strange to hear joy above, and know that below there is only dust, metal, and effort." The company maintained a strict control system. There was a bulletin board in the wooden shed, where sheets with instructions, shift changes, and safety notices were posted. The men signed their initials hastily, leaving charcoal smudges next to their names. Jonathan's appears regularly, in the same consistent handwriting year after year. Nothing stands out until about 2 weeks before his disappearance, a supervisor writes next to the entry, "Commented on strange noises in the east tunnel." This comment, though brief, is important. In another source, a notebook belonging to an engineer who had recently arrived in the region, there is a curious reference to the same noises, described as dry crackling, not compatible with known tools or machines, possibly the result of tension in the inner layers of ore. At the time, this was nothing more than a technical detail. It would only become a question mark decades later, when researchers began to revisit the case with the calm that the urgency of profit had never allowed. On a personal level, the days followed a predictable rhythm. Clara went to church on Sundays, sometimes accompanied by Ruth. Samuel, now old enough to help, went from house to house doing small jobs in exchange for coins and pieces of bread. There is a note tucked between the pages of an old hymn book, attributed to Clara, in which she writes to a friend, "He hardly ever talks about what happens down there. All I know is that it gets heavier every day." The he is Jonathan, and the expression heavier appears again in another context, in an account by a neighbor, Elias Booth, who shared the same shift with him. According to Booth, in the days before his disappearance, Jonathan was more withdrawn, responding in monosyllables, taking a few seconds longer to react to jokes or calls, as if his head were in two places at once, he would say. This change in behavior could be explained by fatigue or financial worries, but the documents do not point to new debts, fights, or illnesses. On the contrary, a record from the company itself shows that Hale's salary had been slightly increased a few months earlier in recognition of his competence and experience. He was not on the list of men about to be laid off, a constant threat in communities like this. However, there is one episode that stands out among the testimonies, repeated with minor variations by 3 different sources. One afternoon, About a week before the collective disappearance, Jonathan left the mine early due to sudden illness, as recorded in the incident log. That day, his colleagues say they noticed something unusual. When he emerged from the elevator, he stood still for a few moments, as if his eyes were slow to comprehend that they had returned to the pale light of the surface. One of them, Thomas Kerrigan, said, Jonathan muttered, "Down there is different." When asked what he meant by that, he did not explain. He asked for water, sat down on the edge of the shed, rubbed his face with his dusty hands, and, according to Clara, spent the rest of the day at home quieter than usual. In the evening, however, he went to the small kitchen table, opened a piece of paper, probably taken from some company form, and wrote for a few minutes, then folded the note in four. This paper was never found. We know it existed because Ruth, already elderly, insisted on recounting this gesture in a recorded interview. "I remember the sound of the pen scratching the paper. Dad hardly ever wrote anything." The small signs that something was out of the ordinary were not dramatic. They were discreet cracks in a seemingly solid routine. A dog that refused to approach the mine entrance on a specific morning, something noted by a guard as mere curiosity, an extra shipment of wood to reinforce internal galleries, requested by an engineer who later could not explain why he thought it necessary as a precaution. Casual comments from miners about a stronger-than-normal smell of iron in certain tunnels. In light of subsequent events, all of this seems to form a set of premonitory signs. But it is important to remember, at the time, these were just details, swallowed up by the urgency of meeting targets, filling wagons, and returning home with a guaranteed salary. In the transcripts of internal company meetings, there is no mention of evacuation plans, temporary closures, or additional inspections. The economic rhythm of the iron pit continued, indifferent to individual perceptions. From an emotional standpoint, the bond between Jonathan and his family becomes clearer in two letters. The first, sent to his brother who lived in another city, briefly mentions his desire to one day leave his job at the mine. "But not now," he writes. "Ruth is still small. Samuel still needs new boots for the winter, maybe in a few years." The second letter, never sent, found among his few belongings, is a crumpled draft in which he seems to be rehearsing a kind of outburst. "Sometimes, when we go down, I feel as if the earth is more alive than it should be, as if it could hear us." Once again, there is no reference to the supernatural, just a somewhat rudimentary attempt to put into words the physical sensation of being surrounded by tons of compressed rock, creaking, settling, breathing slowly around human bodies that insist on piercing it. In the last few days before February 12th, there are records of a more biting cold, a thicker fog, fewer children playing in the street. Small things. The local school attendance book shows occasional absences, possibly due to colds or the need for children to help at home. Life seemed to shrink a little, retracted against winter and against a diffuse feeling of collective fatigue. On the eve of his disappearance, according to Ruth, Jonathan lingered a little longer with his children before going to sleep. He told them a simple story about when he was a boy and used to fish in a distant stream, something he rarely did. Talk about himself. Samuel asked if they could see that creek someday. His father simply replied, "Maybe." The word hung in the family's memory like a promise that would never have a chance to be fulfilled. Witnesses agree that on that night there was no big argument, no visible omen, no bar fight that could later be interpreted as a sign. What there was a discrete accumulation of fatigue, anxieties that could not be adequately expressed, and a man who looked at the mine a little longer than before. When the company whistle sounded, still in the dim light of the following morning, Blackridge Hollow woke up as usual. But in the silent pages of the archives, that morning now carries an almost unbearable weight. It was, unbeknownst to anyone, the last day that 63 men walked together to the edge of the Cumberland sisters' pit, as if it were just another shift. The next concrete record we have of them will be the exact moment when the elevator descended, carrying lanterns, helmets, tool bags, and a silence that, from then on, no machine sound could fill. What happened after that descent is what the next section will attempt to reconstruct, step by step, based on the latest confirmed evidence. In the early hours of February 12, 1906, the surface of Blackridge Hollow seemed shrouded in a fog that did not dissipate even with the sunrise. The miners arrived in small groups, rubbing their hands, stamping their boots on the hardened ground and murmuring muffled greetings. Among them, according to cross-referenced records, Jonathan Hale walked at a slightly slower pace, as if trying to keep up with his own thoughts. The descent elevator, a narrow wooden platform reinforced with iron bars, creaked in the cold, emitting small cracks that seemed to echo more than usual that morning. A guard, in a 1938 interview, said that the sound was the same as always, but it seemed more hollow. Details like this, irrelevant at the time, would eventually become part of the set of oddities that permeate the case. At 6:17 a.m., according to the operations log, all the men on the shift were gathered at the mouth of the shaft. The descent was made in two groups, as was customary. In the first, approximately 40 miners. In the second, 23, including Jonathan. As the first group disappeared into the shadows inside, their lanterns forming a string of small lights that diminished until they were lost, the second group waited in silence. The image recorded by witnesses is that of men huddled together, their breath creating small white clouds in the frosty air, the rough texture of their gloves touching and retouching the handles of their tools, the metallic smell coming from inside the shaft, stronger than usual. When his turn came, Jonathan positioned himself near the edge. Booth, who was at his side, would report decades later that Hale kept his eyes fixed on the void for a few seconds, as if waiting for a specific sound. He seemed to tilt his head slightly, he said, like when someone tries to separate a faint noise from the surrounding noise. But no one else heard anything but the creaking of the chains and the distant hum of the main machine that powered the elevator. At 6:32 a.m., the second group descended. The platform shook under the weight of the men, and darkness enveloped them as they moved away from the pale light of the surface. The smell of damp earth and rusty ore grew thicker, the sound of boots scraping against wood, tools banging against each other, flashlights clinking softly. It all seemed to form a kind of rhythmic beat, a collective sound that, according to experts, helped miners control their anxiety during the descent. The archives reconstruct this moment with surprising accuracy. There are testimonies from engineers, workers, and survivors from other shifts who, although not present on that specific morning, described the environment in the same way. An almost liquid darkness, a feeling of pressure in the ears, a cold different from that on the surface, deeper, more immobile. Upon reaching the main level at around 6:37 a.m., the men dispersed through the tunnels. The East Tunnel, where Jonathan and part of the group would work, was known for its occasional creaking and higher humidity than the others. The walls, reinforced by wooden beams, created long corridors that, illuminated by flashlights, seemed to pulsate with slowly moving shadows. Testimonies collected in the days that followed described the start of the shift as absolutely normal. Tools in use, wagons being pulled, flashlights attached to helmets or hung on nails. Low voices, short instructions, the characteristic sound of metal hitting stone. But it is in the 7:04 a.m. log, made by an inspector who was circulating in the area, that the first documented anomaly appears. According to his report, as he passed the entrance to the East Tunnel, he noticed a smell, stronger than usual, something between iron and old dampness, and noticed that the air current was colder. He did not attach any importance to it and moved on. At 7:19 a.m., and a miner from Jonathan's group, Thomas Kerrigan, claimed to have heard 3 short cracks like wood giving way, followed by a brief silence. He looked at Hale, who was a few feet away, and noticed that his colleague had stopped swinging his pickaxe in the air, staring intently down the corridor. He raised his flashlight, as if looking for something, Kerrigan said. Hale then reportedly took 2 slow steps forward. Nothing was recorded about what he saw, if he saw anything at all. However, this movement is confirmed by 2 other witnesses who, although distant, remember seeing Jonathan's flashlight change position. What happens next is the beginning of the darkest point in the records. At 7:23 a.m., the operations log receives its last entry before the absolute void. Slight tremor, imperceptible on the surface. The observation is brief, almost accidental, but when cross-referenced with later statements it becomes crucial. 3 miners in another sector reported feeling a slight shift in the ground beneath their feet, as if the floor had breathed. However, no collapse was heard, no columns fell, no tools were knocked over. Immediately after that moment, all direct evidence ceases. There are no recorded screams, there is no running, there are no reports of dust rising or rocks falling. There is no sign of smoke, explosion, or mechanical failure. It is as if, in seconds, all human activity inside the pit had been removed from the place, not destroyed, not buried, but suspended. When the elevator returned to the surface to pick up a load of supplies at 7:40 a.m., no one noticed anything wrong. The team on the surface only later noticed the unusual delay in the miner's return signal, which was supposed to occur every 20 to 30 minutes through small knocks on the main pipes. At 8:12 a.m., the supervisor recorded no response from the internal shifts. At 8:25 a.m., another attempt was made. At 8:40 a.m., the internal emergency protocol was activated, a slow and bureaucratic procedure typical of the time. Still, there was no panic. It was believed that there might be a problem with the communication lines or with the movement of one of the mine cars. At 9:03 a.m., 2 inspectors went down to check on the situation. They never reached the bottom. The testimony of one of them, given 2 days later, the only survivor who was able to verbalize anything, states that upon reaching the last section of the main level, the silence was so absolute that it seemed to press on the ears from within. He found no suspended dust, fallen tools, or any sign of air displacement. Only flashlights turned off, leaned against the walls as if they had been carefully placed there. And then, the last confirmed piece of evidence. On the floor, at the fork in the east tunnel, there was a single flashlight still on. And next to it, according to the official report, a small fragment of partially burned paper stuck between rocks. The handwriting was Jonathan Hale's. Only 3 words were legible. It wasn't. The document ends there. The paper mysteriously disappeared during internal investigations. No other sentences were recovered. This is where the historical record ends, and where the mystery begins to grow, almost unbearably. By the time the church clock struck 10:15, the news had spread throughout Blackridge Hollow. No response from the mine. Women left pots on the stove, children ran to the windows, and off-duty men hurried out onto Main Street, driven by an ancient, almost tribal instinct. Something was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of a delayed shift or broken equipment, but wrong in a way that words struggled to describe. At 10:40 a.m., the first search party was formed, consisting of inspectors, afternoon shift miners, and 2 engineers. Their descent was described as the quietest ever recorded, according to engineer Joseph Mallory. He would report in a 1911 document that none of the men spoke during the preparation, and that even the mechanical sounds seemed to hesitate as if waiting for permission to continue. The initial expectation was to find a partial collapse, perhaps a blocked tunnel, perhaps injured men awaiting rescue. It was the most logical scenario, but what they found when they reached the main level did not fit any known explanation. The first galleries were intact. No recent dust, no signs of a fall. No smell of gas, no overturned tools, no signs of struggle or panic. Mallory's report notes, everything was too organized. And then came the most disturbing discovery. All the lanterns were out, except for one, Jonathan's, found still lit, and which, according to the report, had burned almost to the end of the wick. The air around it was strange, too quiet, too heavy, according to later descriptions, although these terms belong more to the emotional than the technical realm. The small fragment of burnt paper with the words, "It wasn't," immediately became the center of attention. The chief engineer asked that it be preserved, But when the document reached the company 2 days later, it had been reduced to an almost illegible charred splinter. A side note in the file mentions improper handling as the reason, but some at the time suggested something different. Someone wanted to avoid dangerous speculation. From that point on, the investigation split into two fronts. The official one, conducted by the company, and the human one, scattered among houses, balconies, and silent prayers. The community Clara Hale was one of the first to feel the irreversible weight of the situation. Witnesses report that she stood in front of the mine for hours, her shawl tightly wrapped around her neck, refusing to return home. She did not scream or beg. She just stared, as if something inside her was trying to recognize an invisible pattern in the void. The other families gathered in small circles, some holding rosaries, others holding children who did not yet understand what it meant when they said that the men did not respond. The local pastor, Reverend Alcott, wrote in his notebook that same day, "There is no sound more terrible than the silence where there should be 50 voices." The first hypotheses. In the days that followed, regional newspapers published hasty versions: deep collapse, not yet located ventilation system failure, toxic gas pocket sudden flooding. None of these hypotheses stood up to what the engineers found. There were no cracks, no chemical odor in the air, no accumulated moisture, and, most disturbingly, no bodies, no signs of burial, no traces of escape. The entrance to the east tunnel, where Jonathan worked, was completely intact. It was there that one of the inspectors found another small clue, a set of boot prints marked in the damp soil, all heading toward the back of the tunnel, but none returning. This in itself was not unusual during work, but the disturbing detail came later. The footprints disappeared abruptly a few meters ahead, as if the ground had been smoothed, or as if the men had been interrupted in their movement. The official report avoided highlighting this. But a handwritten record, found decades later, written by one of the inspectors who preferred to remain anonymous, mentioned, "They looked interrupted, not erased," as if the weight had suddenly ceased to exist. Ambiguous statements, interviews with survivors from other shifts, and with workers who were near the mine that morning, presented details that, taken individually, could be insignificant, but which, when taken together, create an uncomfortable picture. A surface furnace worker reported feeling around 7:20 a.m. a slight but abnormal vibration, similar to when a mine car comes loose. A cook in the shed believed she saw very thin smoke coming out of the shaft, but it disappeared too quickly. And two boys playing near the river claimed to have heard a deep sound, like a large door closing, although no adults confirmed hearing the same thing. None of these reports were taken seriously by the company. At the time, engineers insisted that these were common noises in mining operations. It was only many years later that these details would be looked at more closely, when historians attempted to piece together a more honest picture of what might have happened. A human and plausible revelation. Despite all the strangeness, the most coherent explanation presented by contemporary experts has nothing supernatural about it. It rests on a phenomenon documented in other old mines. Silent internal collapse, followed by sudden isolation of a gallery, creating an oxygen-free pocket. In certain types of soil, this collapse can occur without noise and without external dust. An internal slide into unknown, unmapped cavities that would suck men and equipment into deeper, inaccessible areas. It is a harsh but humane hypothesis, and cruel. Whatever the nature of the collapse, it would have swallowed the group so immediately that no one was able to run, no one was able to bang on the pipes to call for help, no one was able to light a new flashlight. But even this hypothesis leaves gaps. Jonathan's flashlight still on, the fragment of paper, the interrupted footprints, the silence, elements that do not contradict the technical explanation, but also do not fit perfectly into it. And what remains in the archives? What remains is the emotional dimension, the slow devastation that took over the village in the following days, the closed doors, the wakes without bodies, the cracked church bell ringing 30 times, one toll for every 2 lives lost. There is also one last testimony recorded by Reverend Alcott. Clara told me that Jonathan sensed something in the days leading up to it. Not fear, but recognition, as if the mine was showing signs that it had lost its patience. This phrase, both concrete and metaphorical, appears repeatedly in later studies, not as superstition, but as a belated understanding of the kind of sensitivity that experienced men develop in response to the behavior of the earth. A few years later, Clara would sum it all up with a phrase that has spanned generations. What took the men away was no mystery. It was too much silence for too long, and it is in this silence that the file ends, but not the story. The next section will look at decades later when historians revisit the case with the cold distance of time, and discover that certain absences speak louder than any evidence. More than a century has passed since the morning when 63 miners descended for the last time into the Cumberland sisters' iron pit. The village of Blackridge Hollow no longer exists as it once did. Many of the houses have been swallowed up by the expansion of state highways, others have been lost to storms and decades of neglect. The church with the cracked bell still stands, albeit leaning, and the company shed, once the heart of the community, is now just a wooden skeleton consumed by termites and time. Researchers visiting the area arrive with maps, modern flashlights, and notebooks filled with notes. They find a landscape that seems to defy explanation. Silent hills, a wind that passes through the trees without making much noise, and hard soil that hides more than it reveals. The original shaft was sealed in the 1930s after unsuccessful attempts at exploration. The entrance is marked by a rusty iron sign with letters that are almost faded, stating only what has never been questioned. Cumberland Mining Company Operation Site, closed in 1906. Nothing mentions the disappearance. It is in the archives that history remains alive. In local libraries, in private collections, in wooden boxes kept by descendants of families who, in one way or another, were touched by that absence. It is by leafing through these documents that the researcher narrator of this reconstruction understands that the case does not belong only to the realm of facts. It belongs to the realm of memory. And memory, unlike physical truth, has permeable boundaries. Over the years, different authors have attempted to reinterpret the events. Engineers sought geological explanations. Sociologists analyzed the power dynamics between the company and the village. Psychologists discuss the emotional resilience of miners in the face of extreme conditions. But in the end, all approaches converge on one point that cannot be circumvented. No one saw, no one heard, no one recorded the precise moment when 63 men ceased to exist on the surface of history. It is this gap, this abrupt interruption, that makes the case of the Cumberland sisters as much a human enigma as it is a mineral one. Because disappearance leaves no footprints, no traces, no witnesses. It leaves questions that echo like empty corridors. When visiting the sealed site where the mine entrance used to be, many researchers report the same impression, that the silence there has a particular, almost material weight. It is not the silence of mourning, nor of reverence. It is a silence that seems to accumulate, like ancient dust settling on successive layers of time. The historian who retells this story feels this weight, not because he seeks something extraordinary, but because he recognizes in that emptiness the dimension of what could not be told. Clara Hale lived to be 58 years old. She raised her children with dignity, supported herself with sewing and odd jobs, and rarely spoke of her husband. In a late interview, her voice already frail, she said only, "I learned to live with what was left, not with what was missing." That phrase has crossed generations as a kind of key to understanding the emotional impact of that winter of 1906. It was not anger, it was not hope, it was not despair. It was acceptance of the incomplete, acceptance that some stories are written with presences and others, the most difficult ones, with absences. Contemporary scholars point out that the case of the Cumberland sisters miners is not unique in the history of American mining. There have been silent collapses, internal chambers that opened abruptly, deep landslides that were never fully mapped. But among all these episodes, few have left as little concrete material as this one. Few have been so punctuated by small fragments, a lit lantern, a burned piece of paper, interrupted footprints. Few have made it so clear that the mystery was not in what happened, but in what could no longer be recorded. It is this perception that, decades later, accompanies those who open these files, that we are faced with a story that ends before it ends. A story that disappears along with its characters, leaving only the outline of their lives, the echo of their gestures, the inevitably incomplete record of their last movements. And perhaps that is why the case still persists, not as an inexplicable phenomenon, but as a profound document of human fragility in the face of a world that insists on surpassing us. The disappearance of the miners is not a supernatural crack in history. On the contrary, it is a brutal reminder that silence can be as definitive as the rock that collapses, as absolute as the darkness that swallows a flame. The historian closes the file for the last time. He runs his fingers over the worn cover, watching the dust rise and fall slowly, like old snow that refuses to melt. Outside, late afternoon descends on the valley, and the wind carries the same metallic smell that once accompanied those men. And, faced with the immensity of what will never be explained, the narrator allows himself a single reflection. There are stories that do not end. They just cease.